Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour. And you know, when we got the show started, I forgot to go through the preliminaries. So let's go back and do that. We are the Liberty Works Radio Network, and we do need the assistance of members of the listening audience to keep the network operating. So if you enjoy the shows, the information, the discussions, the topics, the hosts and the guests on the other shows, we sure would appreciate it if you could find your way over to the LibertyWorksRadioNetwork.com website and get signed up as a subscribing member. Even if it's as little as $10, $20 a month, every membership helps, and we do need your support to keep the broadcast network operating. So, let's get back into the discussion. As I was saying in the first section, in 2018, they wrote a new tax law which changed the constitutional authority. Well, actually, it didn't change it. It reasserted it and reaffirmed it in the face of the erroneous claim for the last 50 years that the 16th Amendment authorized a direct non-apportioned tax. And the new tax law, the constitutional authority, the expressly written intent of Congress, the claimed authority to write the income tax law, was Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, not the 16th Amendment. And the Supreme Court ruled a year ago in June in Moore et al. v. United States, at 602 U.S. 572, if you want to check the site. The Supreme Court gave us a comprehensive review of the constitutional powers to tax under the Constitution, including a reassertion of all of the limitations and their applicability to each of the two forms authorized, direct and indirect, where all direct taxes, without exception, must be apportioned to the states for payment in proportion to the census, and all indirect taxes must be uniform, which precludes a graduated tax, because graduated isn't uniform with respect to the treatment of the citizens, and it's completely unconstitutional. And I've explained this before. They've gotten away with graduated taxation, claiming that the uniformity required by the Constitution isn't intrinsic, it's geographic. So that as long as the discriminatory policy put in place is uniformly applied across all 50 states, it's okay to not have uniform taxation and to discriminate against the rich and the middle class and not the poor. So you can have different tax rates for the poor is in zero, higher for the middle class, and even higher for the wealthy. Or you can have lower tax rates for the wealthy and higher for the middle class and none at all for the poor, which is pretty much where we're at now. And as long as those non-uniform tax rates are enforced in all 50 states, it's perfectly okay for the government to have non-uniform graduated taxes. Now, here's what's wrong with that theory about geographical uniformity. If we use that theory of geographical uniformity rather than intrinsic uniformity with respect to the treatment of all citizens, regardless of their quote-unquote legislated class, which is unconstitutional, well then, could Congress say, write a tax law that taxes Jews at 95% and Christians at 10%? Or black people at 5% and whites at 80%? Or old people at 15% and young people at 60%? Or those of Italian descent at 50% and those of Irish descent at 80% and those of Israeli descent at 15%? Could they write policy to treat different classes of persons with different rates of tax based on color, national origin, sex, gender, age? Could they? Well, of course they could, as long as it's enforced in all 50 states the same way. It's perfectly fine under this theory of geographical uniformity. Congress could write those laws to discriminate against blacks or Jews or Islam or Christian or young or old or gay or straight or male or female. It's perfectly okay as long as the discriminatory policy is enforced equally in all 50 states. And I say this is constitutional nonsense. Absolute nonsense. Just like it's absolute nonsense that the Constitution would ever allow the government to claim that any man who earned $1 owed a piece of it to the federal government as a function of taxation. Patently unconstitutional, inconceivable to the founding fathers that you would owe money to the government as a function of living and working at an occupation of common law that did not involve any privilege, import, export, or license. Absolutely inconceivable. It's a system of communism, not constitutional taxation. It's a system of class legislation where the government divides the people into different classes, writes different laws for the different classes, and those differences in the law become the basis for a class warfare battle that plays out in the streets of every city in the country. Sound familiar? That's what we've been experiencing for the last, 10 years. Class warfare, battling out on the streets. And here's the irony. The entire population, regardless of which class you're assigned to, immediately begins calling to the government to step in and exercise even more power to end the class warfare conflict that the government engineered with the unconstitutional law intended to divide the people so that the government could step in, usurp, and exercise ever more power over the lives and activities of our society and our people, until ultimately the people are owned and controlled by a federal government that has no territorial or legislative jurisdiction to write law in the 50 states. And it's all been done through the tyranny of an administrative bureaucracy authorized to write law over the warring classes by the regulatory deference put in place under Chevron. And affirmative action further divided the people for the bureaucracy to use the regulatory deference under Chevron to write their own laws to rule the people from the bureaucratic administrations without regard to the actual laws written by Congress. Because Chevron says you have to defer to the regulatory agencies, and boy, did they write their own power, didn't they? Of course, that's what government does, doesn't it? Writes its own power and then waits for somebody to object. And then the courts, because they're part of the government, always say the government was justified in increasing its own powers. And it's all constitutional fraud and tend to create a governmental administrative bureaucracy that rules by de facto operational practice rather than by statutory authority granted under the Constitution and properly exercised. 100% constitutional fraud. And it's been used to create and subsidize the welfare redistribution that the socialists, now the Democrats, are using to buy votes from the poor, the uneducated, the ignorant, the unaware, and the frightened seniors who are afraid of their social security. So government buys their vote while the currency is degraded into worthlessness. They're running it out. We're at 37 trillion and counting, and no indication at all that they're going to either cut back or eliminate the waste of the fraud or the bribery. Social Security, you have to fix this. You have to bring the budget back, balance the spending, and means test your welfare programs. You got to means test Social Security and Medicare. There's no way around it. It's a Ponzi pyramid. Either you go back to recognizing that it's an earned benefit and a privilege, not a right, not a retirement, not a pension plan. It's an earned benefit that you may be eligible for if you need it. It's not supposed to be a program that buys the votes of the old. It's supposed to be, well, originally it was a safety net for widows and orphans. Widows and orphans. And now they're paying so much money out to the upper middle class retired, who are the ones who live the longest because they have the healthiest lives and avoid the most physical impacts. They're paying the bulk of the resources out to a class of people that don't need the resource at all. And that, of course, means there's no resource pool left for the poor who actually need $1,500 a month to survive, but are only getting 7 or 8. Meanwhile, the wealthy are getting $2,000 to $4,000 a month, and they don't need a penny of it. They could live off of the $1 million they have banked. But as long as the government's passing out money, they're taking advantage of human nature. They know the wealthy will take the government money and run up the debt. And then everyone can be told you have to pay the tax to help with the debt. But somehow, no matter how much tax you pay, the debt never goes down. And in fact, the more tax you pay, the higher the debt goes up. Because it's not tax. It's collateralization of the debt. And the more collateralization the bank says you're providing, the more debt they're willing to dish out to Congress to spend and give to its friends to enrich themselves and their own businesses, and of course to buy the votes of the poor, the uneducated, the ignorant, the unaware, and the insecure elderly. It's a system of communistic division and control. It's not one of federal taxation. And the Supreme Court has told us it's not a direct tax. And when the court makes that ruling, when the constitutional authority statement for the federal income tax as of January 1, 2018 becomes common knowledge, the dominoes will start to fall. And that's all it's going to take. Because if the federal personal income tax is not a non-apportioned direct tax without limitation under the 16th Amendment, the only other possibility for it is as an indirect tax under authority of Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, authorized only as a mechanism to measure the amount of tax owed as impost, duty, or excise. And if there's no impost, duty, or excise, there's no tax to measure. Income isn't the object of the tax. It isn't even the subject of the taxation. The subject is impost, duty, or excise taxability. The object is the activity, transaction, event, or place in which the taxable activity takes place. It's not a new power, and no new subjects were created subject to federal taxation as a function of the adoption of the 16th Amendment in 1913. And this has been the consistent ruling of the Supreme Court for 109 years, 111 years now. Well, 109. It was enacted in 1913, but the court didn't rule until January of 2016. So we're at 109 years of consistent holding. It's an indirect tax. The people have been defrauded by the federal government since World War II, and particularly by the circuit courts of appeals all over the country since 1980, which have all got their own precedents that they point to. Instead of any Supreme Court case, they point to their own opinions that simply proclaimed the 16th Amendment authorized a direct non-apportioned tax, even though there's no text in any Supreme Court decision that's ever been written that actually asserts that holding. They just made it up as judges, as attorneys, and attorneys that were educated in socialism, not constitutional law. Okay, we'll be back in 5. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and let's just get right back into it. When the commercial break came up, I was beginning to discuss how the dominoes fall just one right after the other once the 16th Amendment's alleged foundation for a non-apportioned, unlimited, direct tax on all earnings of all persons everywhere. Once that claim to authority to tax directly under the 16th Amendment goes away because of the constitutional authority statement for the new income tax law and because of the Supreme Court decision in Moore et Ux v. United States last year in June, the direct foundation is gone. That means the income tax is not a direct tax under the 16th Amendment. As the court ruled, it is an indirect tax under authority of Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. And that means the federal courts lack the subject matter jurisdiction to enforce a direct tax on income against the individual person. They lack the subject matter jurisdiction to enforce a non-apportioned direct tax that is operationally assessed by the IRS as a deficiency under alleged authority of that amendment to tax directly and without limitation. So because of Moore et Ux and the constitutional authority, it's been exposed irrefutably and inarguably that the federal courts lack the subject matter jurisdiction to enforce the version of the tax they've been enforcing since World War II. It's been a constitutional fraud. The courts lack subject matter jurisdiction to enforce direct taxes against individuals because that power was never granted by the 16th Amendment. And it's that claim, that fraudulent claim, that the power was granted that has been the application, been the basis for the application of the tax on gross income, Section 61. But when we examine the statutes and the Supreme Court's original holding, we see that the tax was originally enacted as a tax that is collected at the source. And we find confirmation of that by the fact that the only liability for the payment of the tax that exists in statute, in the Subtitle A statutes, the body of law enacted in 1913 as part of the original income tax legislation, that's chapters 1 through 6, Subtitle A of Title 26, the only liability for tax in those 6 chapters is the liability of the tax collector, who is made liable for the tax he has collected. That's an indirect tax where the burden is shifted from the worker to the payor of the taxable earnings, who withholds money as tax from payments made to taxable persons who, under the original Tariff Act, were all foreign persons. And that's confirmed in the statutes under sections 1441, 1442, 1443. And it's 1461 is the statute that makes the tax collector, the withholding agents, liable for the tax they collected from the foreign persons as a tariff, under the Tariff Act as an impost. The only place Americans were subject to the tax was in the possessions. And this is all clearly shown in the 1939 law, which I have on the taxfreedom.com website for anyone who wants to look at it. So petitioner, or citizens, generally petitioning in the tax court, are not persons who are made liable by statute for the payment of the tax. So how did the government argue that you are liable? They made it up under Chevron and the regulatory deference. They say Section 1, which imposes a rate of tax. They wrote a regulation that says you're liable for the tax under Section 1. But how are you liable for a rate of tax rather than for monies you collected or that have been assessed on a return, which is the requirement under Section 6201. Assessments are only made by return or on Subtitle E, ATF taxes. And 6020, B requires a return to be made in the substitute for return. If there is a return that has not been filed by a citizen or some other party, the IRS is authorized to file the return. But 6020B requires a return, and 1040 isn't one of the returns that's authorized. Because there is no direct tax. I made it up. And there is no liability for a rate of tax in the statute. They made it up in order to enforce the direct tax they made up under the 16th Amendment, which they made up without any limitation under the Constitution, which is the second plank of the Communist Manifesto, not constitutional taxation. Now, you think somewhere along the line, some judge would have said, hold on, guys, you got a problem here. But no, nobody said a word. They all bowed down and worshipped at the altar of the beast. Money, the paycheck. Got to get the paycheck. To hell if we defraud the population to get our paycheck. We got to get the paycheck. So there is no liability for tax. And the IRS has to forge the signatures on the liens, which aren't authorized, and defraud their own computer system to claim a substitute for return has been made. Because there is no deficiency for tax under Subtitle A. You had no requirement to collect any tax because you didn't do any business with a non-resident alien. And there is no liability in the name of the worker for tax on his own earnings that exists in the statute. Not in the original legislation of Subtitle A, nor even in the employment legislation 32 years later, where they adopt and implement exactly the same scheme of an indirect tax collected at the source that is collected by payors who withhold money as tax from payments made to persons who are subject to the withholding, subject to the tax, or, and here's the new part in 1945, or who ask for the withholding, even though they're not subject and there is no tax imposed. If you ask for the employer to withhold tax from you, you can collect tax. See, now, in 1913, the withholding agent, defined in law at 7701A16, he could only collect tax from foreigners. There's no authority to collect any income tax or withhold any income tax from any person who declares to the payor that he's a citizen. So there was no authority to collect the tax from citizens until you get to the victory tax, and that's a different collection. But in 1945, they create the employers who collect tax, not specifically from citizens, not specifically from foreigners, but from employees who ask for it. And how do you ask for it? It's on the W-4. When you claim married or single, regardless of how many exemptions you claim, you're asking the government to withhold tax from your pay. When there is no tax imposed, there is no liability for tax, there is no subjectivity to tax, there is no tax on your labor, and there is no tax due by law to be paid until next year on April 15th. And nobody can force you to service that possible future obligation without violating the prohibition on involuntary servitude under the 13th Amendment, because forcing someone to service a future obligation before it actually is an obligation is a form of involuntary servitude. And that's prohibited, as well as slavery, under the 16th Amendment. So what it comes down to is having gross income under Section 61 is the next domino to fall, because there is no valid constitutional basis for the indirect taxation by impost duty or excise of rent, interest, dividend, wages, salaries, compensation, commissions, annuities, tips. None of these things, when earned in the 50 states without involvement in any transaction or activity subject to impost duty or excise, none of these things are taxable to the federal government. They're all outside the jurisdiction of the government and the territorial jurisdiction, outside the jurisdiction, both territorially and legislatively. They can't write law for this. The whole thing's been a constitutional fraud. that implements the second plank of the Communist Manifesto, which calls for a heavy, progressive, or graduated income tax. That's where you find graduated taxation, is in the Communist Manifesto, being used to divide the population so the political class can take advantage of the ignorance of the warring classes below them. That's what it's all about. Divide the people, keep them distracted, fighting amongst themselves, and rob them blind. Because they just don't seem to understand. It's the political class that's looting the treasury. While the working classes, the poor and the middle class, are allowed to wage war in the streets as the violence of a class warfare system escalates into either revolution or a police state. So having gross income is no longer a basis for federal taxation under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. It's got to be foreign, import, export, commodities, licenses, or corporate earnings. Having profit, having revenue, having income is not a lawful constitutional basis for federal taxation. The income needs to have been derived from a taxable activity, transaction, event, or place. It doesn't apply to everything that every American does. It's simply a constitutional fraud. And it's this fraud that has created the socialist nightmare we see evolving, where the poor don't get enough to survive. The health care is a gatekeeping system where the poor don't see the doctors or get the care that they need. The money is being run out into oblivion, and the bureaucracy ruling the people gets stronger and stronger with every court decision upholding their unconstitutional and tyrannical nonsense. Straight out of the manifesto. And the courts say, oh, that's okay. The government's more important than the people. The state is more important than the spirit. Our existence is more important than yours. Shut up, sit down, and do what you're told, you peon. This has been the government's attitude since World War II. The graduated taxation, indirect taxation of the American citizen's income is unconstitutional because it is a non-uniform tax constituting unconstitutional class legislation and direct tax, as the tax discriminates against the citizens by the different rates of tax imposed on each of the different classes of persons created under the tax brackets of the legislatively imposed income tax under Section 1. Yeah, it's a class legislation system of unconstitutional, non-uniform taxation. When is the rest of America going to wake up to this fact? Because there's no curing this system or changing it until everyone realizes this is the foundation for the fraud. Everybody in America knows. Everybody knows there's something very, very wrong and un-American with the way the IRS behaves with the American people, the way the Department of Justice treats the citizens in court, and with the way the courts have treated and imprisoned and robbed and destroyed the lives of millions of Americans across decades of constitutional fraud. So wake up, or you're going to lose everything. The law is on your side. It's time to wake up and take back America. Okay, I hear the break coming up. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. I'll be back next week with more on more.